Hi everyone, welcome back to Story of the World Chapter Highlights. I'm Sophie teacher and today we're going to be talking about chapter 31 of your Story of the World 4 books. Now today is talking more about a lot of changes that were happening after the end of World War II. Now the start of our chapter is mainly talking about issues within Egypt, and the second half of our chapter is talking about some changes within Europe as well as Germany. So let's get started. Now, if you remember, when we were talking about Egypt last time, we were talking all about the king who was pushed out of Egypt, if you remember. And then eventually at the end, Egypt kind of became free from British rule and had their own king. Okay? Now, the British, if you remember, at the end was still around. There was kind of a power struggle, if you remember, between the king, the British, and the Wafd, who was the nationalist group in Egypt. They were the people who tried to go on the diplomatic mission to London to try and free Egypt, and they got arrested, if you remember. And they became a really large party in Egypt. They became a political party. Now, after all this happened, the king eventually died, and the second king, was put onto the throne, which was King Farak. King Farak, lots of people had a lot of hope for him. People hoped that he could bring together, the parliament and the Wafd and the British. People really hoped he would bring Egypt together and make it a happier place. But unfortunately, King Farak wasn't that great of a king. He really spent a lot of money on traveling. He liked to travel around and he spent lots of money doing that. He gambled a lot of money as well. And also he got Egypt to enter in a lot of different wars, which they lost, including Israel. Okay, so if you remember from the last chapter that Hannah teacher talked about at the very end, Egypt was one of the countries that went into Israel and invaded. So they also ended up losing that war. So there was a lot of issues with King Farak, and people started to get a little bit annoyed by this point. They were getting a bit tired of the king. One person who was really getting tired of the king was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was a general, okay? He was a military chief. And, he'd come from quite a poor background and he worked his way up throughout the military. And he got to a point when, he had a friend and his friend said to him, we're always fighting outside of Egypt. We're always fighting other countries. But what about defending Egypt itself from, people like the British and other European influences? And Nasser agreed. He thought, why are we bothering invading all these countries when we should be protecting within Egypt and dealing with issues within Egypt? So Nasser had a plan. He wanted to overthrow the king and become the leader himself. His dream was to have a united Arab republic. He wanted all of the Arab nations to come together and be peaceful as one. That was really his dream. So he was like, okay, you've got to go, Farak. You've really got to go. So he got together around 90 soldiers, and the 90 soldiers pushed King Farak out of the country. He left Egypt, and Nasser became the leader of Egypt. He had an 11-person council who led Egypt, and he was the leader at the top. Now, one of the big issues that there'd been throughout this time in Egypt was the issue of the Suez Canal. Now, if you remember, the Suez Canal is a region that connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, and it makes it very easy for trade to go between Europe and places like India. So this was a really important route. And Egypt knew this. They knew it was a very important route. Now, they'd actually used money from France and Great Britain in order to make this canal. But, Nasser started to get a little annoyed. And he was like, why are we still letting the British run this canal when it's our territory? This is our area. And he even had ideas of building a dam, which would help, with irrigation in Egypt and help a lot of farming there. So Nasser ended up going to Eisenhower, the president of the United States. And he said, I need a loan. Please give me a loan. I need to build a dam near the Suez Canal. And, it will really help Egypt. But Eisenhower didn't really trust Nasser. Nasser was close to the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower didn't trust the Soviet Union. So therefore, he didn't trust Egypt. So he said to them, no loan. It's not going to happen. So this really angered Nasser. He got really mad. And on July 26, 1956, he decided to take back control of the Suez Canal, and this became known as the Suez Crisis. He closed down the canal, so no ship that he didn't allow was allowed to go up the canal. This was a really big problem, especially for countries that traded down the Suez Canal, which was a lot of countries at that time, including Israel, France, and Great Britain. They had big interests in the canal. The British were starting to be pushed away, and Great Britain and France were especially mad because they put so much money into it. So on October 29th, 1956, so, around 4-5 months later, they decided to come together, France, Israel, and Great Britain. And they came up with Operation Musketeer. Now, this plan was that Israel would invade Egypt. They would do a ground invasion of Egypt. Then Great Britain and France would step in and say, hey, Egypt, we can help you. And then they would demand control back of the canal. That was their plan. At least that's what Israel thought. But France and Great Britain were actually hoping that Egypt wouldn't agree to their help and that they could end up saying, we can be part of this war, and they could also invade Egypt and just take back control through military force. But they didn't tell Israel this. Now, this was the plan, and they started to enact it. And as they thought, Nasser didn't agree to having help from Great Britain and France after Israel invaded. So Great Britain and France said, okay, we're going to take back control of the Suez Canal through military force. But actually, Eisenhower in the US stepped in. And he said, guys, did we not create the UN in order for countries to, rule their own land and territory? This was the whole reason we came up with the UN in the first place. So he said to Great Britain and France, actually, you can't do that. We're not going to let you do that. And it really embarrassed France and Great Britain to the point that even the Prime Minister of Great Britain stepped down. And he said, okay, maybe we shouldn't be involved in this anymore. And after this, Eisenhower actually made the Eisenhower Doctrine. And he said if any Middle Eastern country needs help in protecting themselves, especially from European powers, they can ask the US soldiers to fight for them. And this was the Eisenhower Doctrine. Okay. Now, moving on to the second part of our chapter today, it was talking all about some of the issues and ways that Europe was being helped after World War II. Now, we had this man, George Marshall. He was the Treasury or the Secretary of the United States, and it was basically his job to help Europe after the end of World War II. Now, Europe had been really decimated during World War II. A lot of the land had been destroyed, and so had a lot of the infrastructures, like roads and hospitals. So Europe needed a lot of help. And the only kind of ground invasion America really had was Pearl Harbor, but there was nothing on the mainland of the United States. So George Marshall did a speech at Harvard, and he came up with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was to give $20 billion to Europe. He had to convince Congress to do this. Also, the government would make movies to promote this and show how useful it would be to Europe. And they would also help Germany too. He did also offer to help Stalin in the Soviet Union, but Stalin wasn't interested in, gaining that money. And he didn't want to, owe a favor back to the United States as well. So this is what they did. This is what they decided to do. And $20 billion went into Europe with the help of the United States. Now, a little later was the issue of what would happen to Germany. No one could agree. None of the allies could agree what to do with Germany. So the people on one side were the Soviet Union, and then you had the US, France, Great Britain on the other. Neither could decide what to do. So they decided to split Germany in half into West Germany and East Germany. East Germany would be under the Soviet Union, and West Germany would be under the US, France, and Great Britain. Now, because East Germany was under communism, it could sometimes be a very difficult place to live, and people didn't have as much money and it wasn't as free. So lots of people, around 3 million, actually left East Germany into West Germany. Now, after a while, the Soviet Union and the leaders in East Germany realized this, and they realized they were losing a lot of doctors and important people. So they actually built a fence that went between East Germany and West Germany. This fence would eventually become a wall, the Berlin Wall, which was about 15 foot high, covered in barbed wire, and there was even landmines around it. This was to stop people who would cross into West Germany for a freer life. This wall is going to be a really big important part as we move even further on into the book. And yeah, it stood up in Germany for around 30 more years after it was built. It even split up families, couples. A lot of people weren't able to see each other anymore because they weren't allowed to travel across Germany. Okay, everyone, well done. See you next time.